Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm just going to wait one more minute to see if anybody else decides to log on. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Melissa Graham. I'm SCS's Forest Products Chain of Custody Technical Manager. And just welcome to our webinar on remote auditing for forest products chain of custody audits. A couple of points of business. We've muted everybody's microphone, so if you do want to ask questions, then please type them into the questions box in your webinar panel. And if I don't get to answer your question throughout today's presentation, or if I don't know the answer, then I will follow up with you after today's webinar. Also, we are recording the presentation and it will be available after today. So let's get started. So I'd like to say welcome again to everybody here. Many of you listening in are already an FSC, SFI, PEFC, or RW certificate holder through SCS, either in the US or perhaps through one of our affiliates located around the world. But some of you may not yet have your certificate through SCS. So I thought I'd just take a couple minutes in the beginning here to talk about SCS. So SCS is a third-party certification body, or CB. We're located in California's Bay Area, and we have satellite offices around the world with representatives and affiliate offices throughout the Americas, Asia Pacific, Europe, and Africa. And we've been a leading organization in third-party environmental and sustainability verification, certification, auditing, testing, and standards development for over 35 years. So since our company was founded in 1984, at the time, food safety was our primary offering, and it remains so today. Over the years, the demand for environmental recognition has grown as consumer expectations of their favorite businesses have increased. So we now operate in all types of environmental certifications. SCS offers an extensive suite of sustainability services, and our programs span a cross-section of industries, recognizing achievements in forestry, green building, product manufacturing, food and agriculture, consumer products, climate, and others. Additionally, because we are our core management and operations staff are based in the California headquarters, we are able to connect with our clients with other specialists upon request. SCS has and continues to be focused on customer service, and we regularly provide answers to questions in new subject areas for us. In our forestry and chain of custody certification programs, we are a global leader. Our global headquarters is in San Francisco Bay Area, And we are the only American company offering all three of the core forestry core forestry schemes. So FSC, SFI, PFC, and for FSC, we hold approximately a 40 to 45% market share in the US. We have a broad network of auditors who are experts in their fields, and we're a trusted partner to many environmental NGOs due to our own dedication to quality and professionalism that's recognized. So our forest certification program came into existence prior to FSC back in the early 90s. From there, we became founding members of the Forest Stewardship Council, and later we became accredited for PEFC and most recently SFI. And we have certified many thousands of companies from all corners of the globe. And here are some of the key certification labels that you'll likely recognize in the forest products industry: sustainable forestry, sustainable energy, carbon offset programs are all central to the industry in 2020. And as noted, customer service is paramount to our business, and it does separate us from our competitors. We have highly capable experts on our 20-member operations teams with nearly 100 auditors in the chain of custody program to serve you. Our turnaround time, our industry knowledge, and our competitive pricing have all really been key to our success. So if you are already one of SCS clients, then thank you so much for working with us. And if you are not already an SCS client, then at the end of this presentation, I'll be providing a contact name for you to get in touch with SCS in order to discuss certification opportunities. So next, we're going to get into our discussion regarding remote chain of custody audits, which is what we are all really here for today. So here's our list of topics for discussion about remote audits. In the next slide, I'm going to start to talk about what a normal on-site chain of custody audit looks like, including the main components and methods that auditors use for chain of custody auditing. Next, we'll talk about the forest products chain of custody schemes responses to COVID-19 and how those requirements are translated into how we need to conduct audits remotely. And in particular, we'll focus on how we can meet the requirements of the visual inspection of your site and your facilities. Then we'll answer the question of how can we plan your audit together, you with your auditor, so that the audit goes smoothly for everyone involved. And then finally, given the use of these new technologies, how does SCS address confidentiality? We'll end with a question and answer session. So as I mentioned earlier, if you do have questions, then please write them in the question box. And I'll definitely try and hopefully I'll answer them throughout the presentation, but if not at the end, we can have that discussion time. So a normal chain of custody audit, this should look familiar, sound familiar to you. It includes these basic 6 elements. There will always be an opening meeting and a closing meeting for an audit. There will always be a procedures review, records review, interviews need to occur, and then a walkthrough of your facility. So for the next couple slides, I'm actually going to go over these elements of what a normal chain of custody audit would look like. So first we have our opening meeting. Of course, this is where introductions occur. We want to know who's involved with your FSC chain of custody program. So you would want to invite those people that are responsible for chain of custody activities and processes. Not everybody needs to be involved in an opening meeting, but maybe some key personnel or sometimes higher ups in a company, a CEO might like to actually participate in an opening meeting as well. So during an opening meeting, we agree to the audit plan. Hopefully it's been discussed and you've seen the audit plan prior to the audit. And if there's questions about the audit plan, that would need to be discussed in the opening meeting. If their timing for lunch is off, then that would need to be discussed. If we're doing a walkthrough, we want to make sure that the appropriate people are available for interviews. So we may not want to do that late in the day when half of the staff have already gone right after lunch or something. So we would agree to our audit plan. An auditor will also go over the scope of your certificate, what standards they're auditing to. If you're a multi-site organization, then which sites are we going to be visiting? That would need to be agreed upon, of course, prior to the audit, but discussed also in the opening meeting. And an auditor would provide any information about previous open CARs, right? So if minor CARs or corrective action requests were issued at your last audit, then those would need to be discussed during the opening meeting and discuss how those might be closed, right? When CAR closure evidence would be reviewed during the audit. And then generally also, an auditor wants to hear you describe your organization. What products do you sell? Who are your main customers? Do you have a lot of chain of custody transactions, FSC or PFC, SFI? Is it a large part of your business? And then also, how does your chain of custody program work? So what control systems do you use? How do you do physical segregation of material? All of that would want to be covered during an opening meeting. And it really is an essential part of an audit for any kind of audit, desk audit, remote audit, or on-site. So next up we have the procedures review and records review. A review of your organization's written procedure will also occur. Your written procedures explain how your organization covers the requirements in the standard. Procedures answer questions like who is responsible for what task, and maybe how often are staff trained on scheme requirements. They also include information about suppliers and products, and they might describe how, for example, your organization separates certified from non-certified material, or how your organization transfers a claim from your supplier to your customers, that kind of thing. A review of procedures often happens prior to the day of the audit so that an audit can be run more efficiently. So always, if possible, try to send your procedures well ahead of your audit date so that your auditor has plenty of time to review them before they get on site. And honestly, just looking at the photo on this slide, I would love to have a place like that to be able to review your organization's procedures prior to arriving on site, but alas, I don't have that available. So anyway, there are also records to review, and this actually does usually happen on site. So records review includes looking at your training records, volume summaries, records of logo approvals, and then also supplier documentation and sales documentation. So usually an auditor will ask for a list of jobs. In some schemes that might be called a material accounting record that lists all of the FSC transactions or PEFC transactions, SFI jobs that you've had over the past audit period, so since your previous audit. So they'll ask for this list, and then they want to sample the related documentation for that specific job, and then potentially review those with you, right? If we're on site, then those documents would be retrieved and perhaps we're sitting around a table and we would look at those documents together. In case as an auditor, if I have any questions, then I'd want you to be available to answer them. So that is really all the procedures and records review. Again, procedures review generally happens before an audit, but records review happens generally on site during the audit day, the day that the audit's scheduled for. So next up, we have a walkthrough of the facility. During a walkthrough, an auditor is really observing methods of material handling and segregation, right? They're looking to make sure that if there is a risk of allowing ineligible inputs into your chain of custody system, that's mitigated, right? So that there is no risk, and they're going to walk through your facility and see how you segregate material. They're also looking for uses of logos and trademarks on products, or maybe promotionally around a facility. It's also during a walkthrough where an auditor might look for health and safety issues, right? This isn't necessarily a huge part of a chain of custody audit, but all schemes require some health and safety standards to be met. So an auditor would be looking for prominent exit signs, eye wash stations if those are necessary, or fire extinguishers being posted, that kind of thing. It's also during a walkthrough of a facility where an auditor would conduct interviews with staff. So during interviews, auditors are trying to gauge the level of awareness of staff about their requirements related to their job that are, dictated by a scheme, by a standard. So is training effective? Can that person answer questions about what they're really supposed to be doing in terms of that scheme and those requirements? Or perhaps an auditor would identify areas where more training is needed. So if they're asking questions and a person isn't necessarily able to answer them, then that could be an opportunity either for improvement, or perhaps it might be a nonconformity if mistakes are also being made. So an auditor is also looking to see if what an interviewee tells them about their job matches what the procedures say about that same process. So when an auditor reviews written procedures, we're checking that those are actually what you do in reality, right? So when we go and we ask somebody, well, how do you know if you're on the transfer system, how do you know the claim that gets put onto your sales documents? And if they explain, well, we review the supplier documentation and then that's what's written in the procedures, then great. It is the same process. The procedures are reflecting what is expected from that staff member. But if those things are in misalignment, then that could potentially either be a nonconformity, or maybe it is just an observation because the written procedures aren't quite adequately describing that process. So that's why we do a walkthrough of the facility. And then, of course, a closing meeting. Closing meetings are always held for audits. Sometimes these can be really quick, and sometimes they can last a lot longer. But this is where an auditor will describe, of course, where you're doing a great job, right? We always want to be able to provide positive feedback to you as the organization so that you know what you're doing right. But then, we may have also identified some nonconformities or opportunities for improvement, or what we might call observations. And if those have been identified during the audit, then we're going to provide a clear explanation of what we saw, and then also the deadlines for addressing those, right? Different types of audits may have dictated different deadline for, major nonconformities, that kind of thing. We'll also provide time for you to ask questions that may come up during the audit. And if they weren't, the auditor wasn't able to answer that previously, when they're walking around or reviewing records or something, auditors always are open to answering questions that you might have. So, okay, given your understanding of these elements of an audit, I'm going to ask everyone a quick poll question. And that question is, do you think there's a difference between a desk audit and a remote audit? So, given what I just talked about, is there a difference between a desk audit and a remote audit? So if you get a chance, just click on yes or no. Let me know what you think. About half of you have voted. So I'll give you another, let's say 10 seconds. Get your vote in. Okay, anybody else want to vote? Answer now. All right. So 93% of those who voted said yes, that there is a difference. So let's see. You're right. They are different. At least, this answer really is just, it's semantics, and it's how SCS and some of the schemes are using the term desk audit, right? So a desk audit is already allowed, okay, for some of these schemes. If you're an organization where you do not take physical possession of material, well, then there's really no reason for an auditor to be on site. For a paper broker or log broker, you're just sitting in an office. So there isn't anything to verify on site. And then the procedures review, records review, and interviews can all be done remotely. And that is allowed. That's already allowed. So today, and potentially for the future, when we're referring to a remote audit, then what we're really talking about is how can we replace a site audit? So given that the schemes have said in the past that site audits must occur in order to audit an organization that receives material on site, and then what are these schemes doing in response to an event that doesn't allow auditors to go on site, right? What are these schemes saying that we can actually do? So next, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the different scheme responses to the COVID-19 event. So given that many counties and states, countries, they're under shelter-in-place orders, at least that's what we're calling it here in the San Francisco Bay Area, or social distancing continues to be a requirement, and that most importantly, the health and safety of our clients and our auditors is our first priority. Then how have different schemes, how has FSC, PEFC, SFI, RW, how have these different schemes responded to the COVID-19 event? Well, the answer is that all schemes are allowing remote audits for chain of custody, but they are only allowing them under certain circumstances. So each of the schemes have provided derogations or guidance documents that have dictated how SCS has proceeded with how we are conducting remote audits. But there are common requirements for all of these schemes to conduct a remote audit. And these really are, so first, there has to be a justification for the remote audit. All of the schemes have said this. they've all said that there has to be a justification and you have to record that justification. So right now, these justifications are due to COVID-19 travel restrictions. For example, if an auditor cannot travel to your organization because of government restrictions, then a remote audit is justified. Or if an organization's own company policy is to only allow key staff members on site because of COVID-19, then also a remote audit is justified. So first we justify it, then we have to know whether or not a remote audit can cover the entire scope of a certificate. So this means that all the relevant requirements must be audited to the fullest extent of their applicability to an organization. So if an organization takes physical possession of material, then material handling must also be fully audited. It also requires that an organization has the technological capability to conduct that audit remotely, right? SCS, we might say, yes, we can do this. We know how to do a virtual walkthrough and we're ready. But, if an organization doesn't have some capability, some technological capability to do that audit, then we may not be able to do a remote audit. We may have to postpone it. Finally, schemes have provided other considerations that we need to think about. So if there are open major nonconformities, right? Can those nonconformities be addressed and be audited remotely? And can they be audited adequately remotely? The use of outsourcers. If a company uses perhaps high-risk outsourcers, then that would need to be considered. Or, of course, the procurement of specified or significant risk supplies. So all of these must be reviewed prior to allowing a remote audit to be conducted. So before SCS can do a remote audit, we first have to conduct an assessment that covers these elements. So, and I already mentioned this, but we do have to maintain records of these assessments. We have created a guidance document that outlines these different requirements and that summarizes these guidance documents. I'm just going to show this document really briefly, and of course this is available for you upon request. So this is our guidance document. We have tried to cover all of SCS's forest products, chain of custody, and FM schemes, and then taking what those audit restrictions are from the different schemes. So I'm actually just going to click on the FSC guidelines really quick. And you can see that the way that we have set this guidance up for clients is that, we have the requirements or the exceptions and then some instructions. So what you would do if you were reviewing this document along with your account manager, your SCS account manager, you would say, okay, well, I'm required to have a surveillance audit this year. So we'd go to the FSC surveillance audit section and see what we can do. And again, these are the questions that we would need to address prior to being able to conduct your audit remotely. And if we can, then we have a document that we're maintaining and we would assign your audit. And then the next step would be that you would be hearing from your auditor to actually schedule your remote audit. Again, this is on request. This is upon request. You can send me an email and I can send it to you. I will also say that this document is in the middle of being updated right now, and that is because several of the schemes have provided updates, but also FSC right now is not currently allowing that initial evaluation main audit to be conducted remotely, but they're in the midst of changing that requirement, and they are working on a derogation that will allow us to do those. So this document would then need to be updated and again provided to clients. So So those are the scheme responses to the COVID-19 event. And as I mentioned in the previous slide and previous to that, one of the key requirements that must be met is that an organization must have the proper tools in place for an auditor to be able to conduct a remote audit. So this brings in this acronym ICT, or Information Communication Technology. And many of the schemes, including PFC and SBP, SFI, have said that the document IAF MD4, which dictates the use of information communication technology in remote auditing, it's a key guiding document that we need to follow. And in that document, it provides this definition that ICT is the use of technology for gathering, storing, retrieving, processing, analyzing, and transmitting information. ICT includes software and hardware, such as smartphones, handheld devices like iPads or tablets, laptop computers, desktop computers, drones, video cameras, wearable technology, artificial intelligence, and others. All of these tools can be put under this category of ICT. And ICT really is used to optimize audit or assessment effectiveness and efficiency, and it's to support and maintain the integrity of the audit, the assessment process for the different chain of custody schemes. So here are just some general examples. This should sound familiar to you, but meetings. So by means of teleconference facilities, including audio, video, data sharing. There's the audit assessment portion of documents and records by means of remote access, either in real time or prior to an audit, right? So if you are sending documents to review prior to an audit, then that wouldn't really be considered that it's being done in real time during the audit day. So recording of information and evidence by means of photographs, video, or other audio recordings, providing visual or audio access to remote or potentially hazardous locations in your facility. So these are all examples of ICT use that may come into play during a remote audit. So teleconferencing and meetings. So these are really what are used for opening and closing meetings. They can also be used for personnel interviews. So, for example, if I do need to talk to that person at the printer who's responsible for obtaining logo approvals, then I may want them to walk me through that process, which could require them to show me their computer screen. So that would not happen during an opening or closing meeting, and I might need to schedule that interview at a different time during the day. So these teleconferencing tools, could be logged on and off throughout a day, and all of that would have to be discussed ahead of time. And of course, sharing screens. So if you have supplier documentation that you need to show, or sales documents, then we could review those records together on screen. So now let's get to the walkthrough, because really this is the meat of the presentation, where we try to figure out how can we do a virtual walkthrough. So remember that the different forestry schemes have said that we must be able to audit the full scope of the certificate. So this includes not only your volume control systems like a credit account, or the records like the supplier and sales documentation. It also includes a walkthrough of your facility if you take that physical possession of certified material. So this portion of your virtual or remote audit really needs to be planned carefully in terms of timing and technology. So when we're auditing an organization that doesn't qualify for a desk audit, remember we talked about a desk audit, those already exist. They do not have to go through this process. We can just do them like we have done for years. But if an organization does not qualify for a desk audit, then it means that there are critical control points in your system that need to be verified visually. So even for remote audits, we need to use some technology tool to be able to see your facility and visit those critical control points. Some of these could be, for example, a receiving area. So when an organization first receives material, certified material, there's a verification process that they would need to go through. So we might need to see that area, receiving area, a processing area, to ensure that people who are actually working on the production of a product, they're not going to be reaching for uncertified material, right? We want to know what that processing area might look like, and storage as well. And then shipping, that could also be a key critical control point in your system. So one of the key questions that we're going to be asking in the planning stage is whether or not you have adequate Wi-Fi coverage throughout your site. So if you don't, for example, there's a corner of your warehouse that that you don't have any Wi-Fi coverage, or cell service even, then we would have to discuss other options to be able to visually verify those areas of your facility. And also, again, we want to be able to interview people who work on site. So this could mean a warehouse manager or a receiving and shipping manager. So during the walkthrough, we'll have to consider, what's the best time for these interviews, and is during the walkthrough the best time for it, or do they need to be set up separately, through a different tool? Maybe we have to go back to our laptop computers and use Skype or something like that. So all of these things need to be thought about when we're actually planning your walkthrough. And okay, so like I said, this virtual walkthrough, it requires some additional planning. And if your auditor has never been to your site before, then they may need some help in understanding where your critical control points occur in your facility. What does your facility look like? They won't know this. So before your audit, an auditor might ask for maybe floor plans or a map of your facility. And another tool for planning a walkthrough could be the use of what's called, Google Satellite View. And it allows for an overhead view of pretty much any site in the world. It can allow an auditor to see where the path of how a walkthrough could occur on your site. And so I'm just going to show you an example of what this could mean for you and an auditor. So this is a screenshot of a Google satellite imagery. So prior to your walkthrough, right, an auditor might ask you to point out where key activities occur. So this way, when, if you're doing the real-time walkthrough via video, via FaceTime on your phone, then an auditor would be able to know sort of the path that you're taking throughout your facility. They'd be able to kind of visualize where you are within your facility. And this is, again, is where we would need to know where there may not be Wi-Fi connectivity, so that, again, other arrangements can be made. If there's that corner of your log yard where that Wi-Fi doesn't reach, then how can we conduct that part of the walkthrough? And the main options for this have been, honestly, for you to take your video camera, your phone, whatever you want to use, and do that walkthrough on your own. Provide commentary as you're walking through that area, take the video, and then submit that to SCS. If that is the option, then that would need to be done prior to the audit so that that could be discussed during the audit, right? The auditor might need time to review that. And of course, you would probably want to review that with the auditor so that you can explain what's going on beyond maybe just the commentary that you're providing. There's another option is photographs. It's not necessarily a preferred option, but it could work as well. So again, those would need to be reviewed with your auditor to make sure that if they have questions, then you would be there to be able to answer them. Also, we might require you to take some close-ups. So for example, if there are on product labels, we might say, can you please take a few photographs of the material that you have in storage and the label that's on that material. Also, if you're shipping out material that is labeled, we would say, okay, could you provide a photograph of that label and say, okay, it's going with this job number, right? So that an auditor needs to be able to compare an on-product label with the sales documentation that goes with that label. So these are all the things that we have to think about for a virtual site audit, and that these really need to be planned in advance with your auditor. So, and again, this is just a random log yard that I've taken the screenshot of the Google satellite imagery, and this could be done by you, or it could be done by the auditor, and they might send it to you, and then you could have a conversation about what this really means and where things really occur within your facility. Okay, so we're getting towards the end. I hope everybody is hanging in there with me. The next key thing I want to talk about, which I've touched on throughout this, is planning your audit. So you wouldn't think that a remote audit would require, I can send you documents, whatever you need via email, that's fine. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes we do need to discuss those extra ICT tools that we're using. So how do you plan for your audit with your auditor? And honestly, the planning phase is more important for a remote audit than an in-person audit. It really is. The first questions that, the first reasons that you will need to coordinate with the auditor, you're going to have to figure out which ICT tools you want to use. So some questions that you may be asked are, what do you already have available? Right? If you're familiar with and you're already using remote meeting tools, then we can consider using those first. But we do need to be sure that the tools are mutually available. So SCS right now is using Microsoft Teams meetings. They're quite easy, and it doesn't require you, the organization, to use Microsoft Teams on a daily basis for you. There's no requirement for you to have it installed on your computer or anything like that. We can just send you a meeting request, and then it's web-based. So that's generally what SCS auditors are using for, those virtual meetings. We might also ask, what resources do you need to coordinate on your end? Do you need a meeting space? Do you need different computers? We need to make sure that you have times to get things in order so that, no one is trying to do this on the morning of the audit. And then, what can the auditor or SCS help to provide? What resources can we help to provide in terms of conducting your remote audit? One example is that we actually have some pretty fancy cameras that some of our organic audits are using, and we may have those available. So if you feel like those require some additional planning, and because we ship and receive it back and forth, and so those do require some additional planning and processing, but we might be able to provide some kind of resources for you. And then access to information. So it may not be as accessible as an on-site audit. So we need to make sure that you have time to get the materials that you need ready and potentially sent to the auditor prior to the audit. So if there's limited access to your facility right now, then that would require planning for you to be able to go on site and be available for a virtual walkthrough or be available to take those videos, and then also potentially retrieve records that may not be available to you if you're working from home. So those are all things that need to be considered. And then scheduling interviews, and I mentioned this a little bit already, but scheduling interviews with more than one person, and then possibly scheduling ICT use with more than one person. So if an auditor, what if an auditor needs to Skype with more than one person? For example, as I mentioned this, if an auditor wants to interview a person responsible for logo approvals, well, if they're working from home or they're only available during certain days, something like that, then that time may need to be scheduled specifically with that staff member. So remember, a remote audit is still scheduled for a specific date with, we would need confirmation that on that day, relevant people will be available to participate by phone or online or email information as requested. An auditor will still need to be able to sample for documents ahead of time. Remember, I mentioned that list of jobs. You're going to want to provide that to your auditor ahead of time so that you have time to retrieve those records. And then finally, an auditor is going to complete all of their normal pre-audit activities. They're going to alert you about any open cars. They'll review your procedures, your supplier list, product group list. They'll review last year's report, and then they'll also look at trademarks and logos that are used on your website if you use them. And so all of that normal sort of pre-audit activities that an auditor conducts prior to your audit will still occur. Okay, finally, confidentiality, and this is my last slide. So if you have questions, then please start adding them into our questions box. But confidentiality is still maintained through a remote audit. All SCS auditors, the account managers, technical reviewers, we are all bound by confidentiality agreements. So any evidence that we review, either that you have supplied to us prior to the audit, or that we look at for real time while we are conducting your virtual walkthrough, all of that evidence is confidential. We don't release it out to anywhere. It's only available to us as auditors, as your certification body, so that we can make a certification decision. It's also may be made available to ASI upon request, and ASI is the organization that maintains SCS's accreditation to be able to conduct chain of custody audits. And then finally, FSC, if they request documentation or evidence from an organization's audit, then they are allowed to look at it. And then of course the FSC database. So if you are a controlled wood client and you have your controlled wood public summary, that is available on the FSC database, and that is available to the public. And then of course any other information on the database, like your products and species, things like that. All of the listing is publicly available. But other than those, we keep all of your information confidential, and that's including if you take any photographs or provide videos. Those are treated just as any other audit evidence is treated. So that's it. That's what I have for today. I really appreciate everybody joining me, but I am open for questions now. So let me go to the last slide really quick. And again, my name is Melissa Graham. I'm the technical manager. And for new clients, if we have anybody out there who's interested, then please contact Joe Kochansky. He's our business development manager and would be happy to talk to you and walk you through any certification steps with SCS. So that's it. Let me open up our questions and see if anybody has asked any throughout. Let's see. looks like there's a couple. Okay, so when, and I'm sorry, I don't know actually who asked the question, but it says when the certificate holder is a logger that exclusively handles certified products through, so FSC 100% or something like that, and the logger is a member of a CoC group, is it necessary to use technology like visual access to audit the workers in the forest? So if this is it enough for the auditor to talk to the workers through mobile phone, for example? So if the loggers are considered outsourcers and let's see, they're handling the certified products, it would depend. Okay, so the answer to this is that it would depend on how we classify them. If we classify them as a high risk outsourcer, because a company is outsourced with them to, harvest logs, then we would need to decide if we have to go visit that location. Loggers are a bit different than other outsourcers. So it would probably require a deeper conversation with your account manager to determine if we would have to go. But in this case, it may be sufficient to just interview them through, through phones, that kind of thing. They probably would not have to walk through the forest or do any kind of visual inspection of the forest, because if they are sourcing from a certified forest, then there shouldn't be any risk of mixing with other uncertified logs. So good question. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to ask? So I've got a question about FaceTime, and that's actually a really good one. So yeah, if you have FaceTime available on your iPhone, that's a perfectly legitimate tool for us to be able to do a walkthrough of your facility. So let's see. So there are questions, but I am not, how do I? Okay, let me see. There are definitely some more questions in here. So here's a question. It says, would you be able to share the audit scope, specifically how far down the supply chain these supply chain audits need to go? So if so specifically, for example, a consumer good company purchases preprint from a supplier and the supplier is providing consumer good company with certified sustainable fiber, does the consumer goods company need an audit, or is the consumer good company out of scope? It all depends on who is providing the claim, right? If your supplier is certified and then you want to be able to provide a claim to your customers, then you would need to be certified. But when I'm conducting a chain of custody audit for an organization, then I'm conducting it on their supplier documentation. And of course, their supplier would need to be certified. And then that supplier is going to go through an audit, right? And their suppliers would be audited at their audit. The difference that comes into play is perhaps for controlled wood, because if a company is sourcing uncertified material through the controlled wood program, then that chain might go back further. But that's a good question. We have to be able to at least ensure the traceability and the certified material that's coming through your own organization. Okay, so how are remote audits scheduled when the building is not open, even for much of the essential staff to conduct annual training of FSC and safety standards? That's a great question. this is part of that risk assessment that we have to do in the beginning. We have to ask these questions. If your building is not open, right, even for essential staff, and you do not have access to records or to those areas that we would need that visual verification, then we may not be able to do a remote audit. We may have to postpone that audit. It just really depends on what you have available and what you have access to. Um, and for something like training records, if those aren't held online, but they're in a binder in somebody's office, if that binder can't be retrieved, then you don't have access to it. So we would not be able to audit it. Good question. Here's another one. Can the remote auditing system also be used for FM management audits? And the answer to that is, I believe, yes. I'm a chain of custody auditor, but I do know that they are working through tools to be able to do some FM audits. Now, I do know that FSC has said no to initial FM audits to be done remotely. That's not being allowed. But surveillance audit, my understanding is that yes, they are using remote auditing tools to conduct those FM surveillance audits. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay. This is another good question. Concerning the travel-related expenses component of the cost of a typical audit, will that be refunded since there will be no travel by the auditor? We're actually adjusting our prices for that. So that's a question for you to discuss with your account manager. Definitely ask. Because auditors are not traveling, then those travel costs, which we have split out from the professional costs of the auditing, those are generally they are being removed from the invoice. So that's a question for you to definitely check in with your account manager. And the account manager is that person who's generally first contacting you about your audit. They're the ones who are going to ask you these questions if, do you have high risk outsourcing? Or do you have the technological capability to help us do a remote audit? But yeah, that's a good question for your account manager. My understanding is that all of the travel related expenses component would be removed from that audit. Okay, let's see. All right, so normally for FSC, my organization would do an annual training audit. Okay, as well as a safety training. All right, so this was scheduled to occur, but then we were all forced to telework due to COVID. So now safety and annual training can't occur until the office opens back up. So that would be something to discuss with your auditor. If you can still do the rest of the audit, right? For example, you still have some access to your site so that we could do a virtual audit. If you still have access to other records, maybe previous training records, then what I imagine I would do is probably write some kind of minor nonconformity and talk about, here's the plan for this organization to conduct their annual training. However, it hasn't occurred. And then you have 12 months to do that prior to your next audit. So I believe that's the strategy that I would take. But again, it depends on what you do have available. If you can show that you have done annual trainings in the past, that they're regular, that there's good attendance, then I think that could be discussed with your auditor. And I would say that simply because you do not have those training records available or that you did not conduct those trainings recently, those are not enough reasons to not do a remote audit, okay? All of that can be discussed with an auditor. Okay, do video interviews or video walkthroughs need to be recorded? This is, okay, no, they don't. It depends, right? So if you're doing a real-time video, you are on FaceTime, Skype, WhatsApp, and you are talking to your auditor and you're walking through the facility, then those are not recorded. Think about when an auditor is on site and they're doing your um, in-person walkthrough of your facility. They're not recording. They're taking notes and they're interviewing people, but they're not recording that walkthrough. So no, they do not need to be recorded. However, if there are areas of your facility that don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have cell connectivity, then you would be responsible to either go take those photographs or videos and then provide those to us. So in those situations, we would need that recording of what you've done in that walkthrough. But otherwise, no, the real-time video interviews and walkthroughs are not recorded. Okay. WhatsApp, yes, absolutely. WhatsApp is commonly used in Mexico and in faraway communities with no cell phone signal. I have WhatsApp on my phone. I know that most of, if not all, of the SCS staff auditing team has WhatsApp on their phone. So that could be a really good tool to use for conducting that virtual walkthrough. WhatsApp, FaceTime, trying to think of others that are like that. I mean, Skype is another one that I have on my phone. So all of those tools could be used. Is a chat communication considered as a possible evidence for remote auditing? That's a great question, Carlos. And I was, thinking about that actually with the training question. So if you can have a group chat with your team, your organization's FSC team, and conduct a training that way, then I would certainly, absolutely accept that as a training record. So a chat record of a chat communication could be considered as possible evidence. It would have to be robust enough. It would have to provide the evidence for whatever requirement we're trying to meet. But I would absolutely, yes, I would absolutely consider a chat communication as possible evidence. It's a great question. All right, I think I've made it to the bottom of all of the questions. Those were really great. Just trying to scroll through and see if I think I've got all of them. Okay, well, here's the deal, folks. If you have more questions, please feel free to email me, talk to your account manager, talk to your auditor. If you are able to do a remote audit, then remember, you need to be in close communication with your auditor as you plan your remote audit. And for any of those folks out there who are not already certified with SCS, then please contact Joe, and welcome to working with SCS. And that's what I've got for today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you are all healthy, safe, and doing well, and take care.